The sound woke me up before the sun had even thought about rising. It was loud, angry, and completely out of place in the quiet morning. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. A truck, a storm. But when I pulled back the curtains and looked outside, my heart sank. There they were, two massive bulldozers tearing through my fields like they owned the place. My beautiful farmland, the same land my family had worked on for generations, was being ripped apart right in front of my eyes. I threw on a jacket and ran outside, shouting as loud as I could. "Stop! What are you doing?" The noise drowned me out at first, but eventually one of the machines slowed down. The driver leaned out of his cab, squinting at me like I was some kind of bug buzzing around his ear. "What do you think you're doing?" I yelled again, waving my arms wildly. He shrugged, looking bored. "Orders from the HOA," he said, like that explained everything. Then, without another word, he turned back to his controls and revved the engine. Just like that, he went back to destroying my life's work. HOA. What did a homeowners association have to do with my farm? This wasn't some fancy suburban neighborhood. This was open land, soil that had fed my family and countless others over decades. And now, these strangers were ripping it apart because of paperwork? I stood there, frozen, watching helplessly as the earth I loved so much was churned into chaos. Each scrape of the blade felt personal, like someone was deliberately trying to erase my history. That field wasn't just dirt, it held memories. Memories of planting seeds with my dad when I was a kid, of harvesting corn under the summer sun, of quiet evenings sitting by the fence, listening to the crickets sing. Now it was all disappearing under steel treads. That's when something inside me shifted. The shock gave way to anger, not the explosive kind that burns out quickly, but the slow, simmering type that makes you want to fight back. Because here's the thing no one knew, not the driver, not whoever sent him, not even the people behind this so-called HOA. I didn't just own this farm. Oh no, I owned everything. Every single acre in this county belonged to me. All 600,000 of them. My father had been a smart man. He bought up parcels of land bit by bit over the years until he owned the entire county. When he passed away, it all came to me. Roads, forests, rivers, even the ground beneath the new housing developments popping up everywhere. All of it was mine. Legally, officially, indisputably mine. And yet, here we were. These people thought they could roll in and destroy my property without even checking who owned it. They had no idea what they were messing with. No idea at all. As I watched the bulldozers continue their assault, a strange sense of calm washed over me. Sure, I was furious, but I was also intrigued. How far would they go? Would they realize their mistake before it was too late? Or would they dig themselves deeper into a hole they couldn't climb out of? Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. They'd made a very big mistake, and sooner or later, they'd find out exactly how big. After the initial shock wore off, I knew I had to figure out what was going on. Standing there in the middle of my ruined field wasn't going to fix anything, so I headed back inside to dig through the legal documents. My father had always been meticulous about keeping records, and I hoped somewhere in those files was an answer, or at least a clue. The kitchen table became my command center. I spread out maps, deeds, and old letters while sipping on coffee that went cold before I even took a sip. It didn't take long to piece together the story. Apparently, the Homeowners Association for Whispering Pines Estates, a shiny new subdivision that had sprung up a few miles away, had decided my unused farmland would be perfect for expansion. They claimed it was part of their master plan for growth and development. But here's the kicker. They never checked who actually owned the land. Instead, they filed paperwork claiming eminent domain over the property. Eminent domain is when the government takes private land for public use. But in this case, it wasn't the government doing the taking. It was a group of suburbanites trying to build bigger houses with nicer lawns. Their argument was laughable. Something vague about community improvement and zoning laws that didn't apply to me anyway. They acted like they were entitled to my land just because they wanted it. But none of them bothered to look deeper. If they had, they'd have discovered the truth. Every inch of this county belonged to me. Every tree, every stream, every patch of dirt. They were all mine. Even the roads they drove on to get to their fancy homes. Yep, mine too. The irony was almost poetic. These people thought they were expanding their little empire, but they were stomping all over someone else's kingdom without even realizing it. As I read through their sloppy filings, shaking my head at their carelessness, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Part of me was furious. They had no right to touch my land, let alone destroy it. Another part of me was amused. How could anyone be so reckless, so arrogant? Did they really think they could bulldoze their way into ownership without double-checking the details? That's when an idea began to form in my mind. Instead of storming into their next meeting and laying down the law, maybe I should let them keep going. Let them dig their own grave, so to speak. After all, revenge is sweeter when it's served slowly, and I wanted to see just how far they'd push things before they realized their colossal mistake. By the time I finished reading through the papers, I had a plan. I wouldn't confront them, not yet. First, I'd play along. Pretend to be the confused farmer who didn't understand what was happening. Let them think they were in control. Meanwhile, I'd gather evidence. Photos of the destruction, copies of their ridiculous paperwork, emails proving their intentions. Everything I needed to turn the tables on them. As I sat there staring at the mess of documents on my table, I felt a strange sense of calm. These people had underestimated me, and that was their first and biggest mistake. Little did they know, the real power in this situation belonged to me. And soon enough, they'd learn exactly who they were dealing with. The next morning, I decided to pay the HOA a visit, not to confront them, not yet, but to play along and see how deep this rabbit hole went. If they thought I was just some clueless farmer who didn't know his rights, then fine. Let them believe that. It would only make the eventual reveal sweeter. I drove to the Whispering Pines Estates Community Center, where the HOA held their meetings. The place looked like it belonged in a magazine. Perfectly manicured lawns, flower beds bursting with color, and shiny new mailboxes lining the streets. Everything screamed order and control, which made me wonder how anyone could live like this without suffocating. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself as I walked into the office. Mrs. Caldwell, the president of the HOA, greeted me with a tight smile. She was exactly the kind of person you'd expect to run an organization like this. Polished, poised, and radiating authority. Her blonde hair was styled impeccably. Her pearls gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and her voice had that practiced politeness that made you feel both welcomed and dismissed at the same time. "Mr. Harris," she said, gesturing for me to sit down across from her desk. "We understand your concerns about the recent developments on your property." "My property?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. I wanted to laugh at how casually she said those words, but I bit my tongue. "You mean the land you're tearing apart without permission?" She waved a hand dismissively, like I was being overly dramatic. "It's not quite that simple," she explained. "The board determined that the land is essential for our expansion plans. Progress sometimes requires sacrifice, Mr. Harris." "Sacrifice?" I echoed, leaning forward slightly. "You're destroying my livelihood. That's more than a sacrifice. It's theft." Her expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Rest assured, we'll compensate you fairly once the sale is finalized." "Sale?" I asked, letting genuine confusion creep into my tone. "What sale? I never agreed to sell anything." Mrs. Caldwell blinked, clearly unprepared for that response. For a second, she looked almost nervous, but then she straightened up and plastered on another one of her polished smiles. "Oh, don't worry about the specifics right now. We'll handle everything. You just focus on transitioning smoothly." Transitioning smoothly. Was she serious? I wanted to throw the truth in her face right then and there. I own the entire county, lady. But instead, I forced myself to stay calm. This was too entertaining to end so soon. Well, if you say so, I replied, shrugging like I was resigned to my fate. But I hope you know what you're doing. I wouldn't want any complications later. Her smile tightened even further. There won't be any complications, Mr. Harris. Trust me. Trust her. Oh, I trusted her, to walk right into the trap I was setting. As I left the office, I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. These people were playing chess while I was already 10 steps ahead in a game they didn't even realize they were losing. Over the next few days, I let them keep going. Bulldozers rolled in daily, flattening more of my fields. Contractors marked out plots for new houses, and real estate agents began showing off lots to eager buyers. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, watching from the sidelines as they built their dream homes on borrowed time. Every email I received, every invoice I saw, every photo I took, it all added fuel to the fire I was building. And the best part, none of them suspected a thing. They thought they were untouchable, invincible. But soon enough, they'd learn the hard way that no one messes with someone who owns the ground beneath their feet. The day of the big reveal finally arrived, and I could barely contain my excitement. Weeks of watching them bulldoze my land, file their ridiculous paperwork, and act like they were untouchable had been building up to this moment. It was time to pull the rug out from under them. I walked into the HOA meeting room carrying a thick folder stuffed with documents, photos, and maps. The room was packed. Board members, contractors, even some curious residents who'd heard rumors about the farmer causing trouble. Mrs. Caldwell sat at the head of the table, looking smug as usual. She probably thought I was here to beg for mercy or negotiate a settlement. Boy, was she in for a surprise. "Good evening," I said, setting the folder down on the table with a loud thud that made everyone jump. All eyes turned to me, and I couldn't help but smile. This was going to be fun. Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat, trying to sound authoritative. "Mr. Harris, we weren't expecting you tonight. Is there something we can assist you with?" "Oh, absolutely," I replied, pulling out a map of the county. I unfolded it dramatically and laid it across the table so everyone could see. "Let's start with this." Confused murmurs rippled through the room as people leaned in to examine the map. Every parcel of land within the county lines was shaded in red. "This," I said, tapping the map firmly, "is what I own. Every single acre marked in red belongs to me, including the 600 acres you've been tearing apart." Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone laughed nervously, thinking it might be a joke. But when they saw the serious look on my face, the laughter died instantly. You can't possibly own all this," Mrs. Caldwell stammered, her voice wavering for the first time since I'd met her. "Actually, I can," I said calmly, opening the folder and sliding over photocopies of deeds, property titles, and legal documents. "Here's proof. My father bought up most of these parcels years ago, and now they're mine. Legally, officially, indisputably mine." Panic spread across her face as she flipped through the papers. Other board members crowded around, their expressions shifting from disbelief to horror. One man muttered, "This has to be fake," while another woman whispered, "We're ruined." Ruined? Not quite yet, but close. I let the weight of the evidence sink in before continuing. "Now let's talk about what you've done. You bulldozed my land without permission, destroyed crops worth thousands, and disrupted ecosystems that took decades to develop. And don't get me started on the houses you've been selling on land you never owned in the first place." At this point, chaos erupted. People began shouting questions, accusations, and excuses. A contractor stood up, yelling about unfinished projects. A resident demanded to know if her new home was still valid. Mrs. Caldwell looked like she might faint. But I wasn't done. "You have two choices," I said, raising my voice to cut through the noise. "Option 1. Pay full restitution for the damage you've caused, revoke all claims to my land, and dissolve the HOA entirely. Option 2. I sue every single one of you into bankruptcy. The room went silent again. No one dared to breathe. They knew I meant business. Mrs. Caldwell tried one last desperate plea. "Surely we can come to an agreement," she said, her polished demeanor crumbling. "An agreement?" I shot back, leaning forward. "You destroyed 600 acres of my land without even checking who owned it. Now you want to bargain." She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, realizing there was nothing left to say. Defeat hung heavy in the air. As I gathered my folder and stood up, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. These people had underestimated me, trampled over my rights, and acted like they were above the law. Now they were paying the price for their arrogance, their greed, and their carelessness. Walking out of that meeting room, I didn't feel anger anymore, just relief. Justice may take time, but when it arrives, it hits hard. And trust me, they felt every ounce of it. The fallout was immediate and chaotic. By the time I left the meeting room, word had already started to spread like wildfire. The board members scrambled to contain the damage, but it was too late. Someone snapped a photo of the map I'd laid out on the table, and within hours, it was plastered all over social media. Local news outlets picked up the story, turning it into a headline-grabbing scandal. HOA destroys farmland only to discover they don't own it. Residents of Whispering Pines estates were thrown into panic. Buyers who had signed contracts for homes in the new development demanded refunds, realizing their dream houses might never legally exist. Contractors abandoned half-finished projects, leaving gaping holes in the ground where foundations should have been. Banks froze loans tied to the subdivision, citing legal uncertainty. And through it all, Mrs. Caldwell and her team floundered, trying desperately to salvage what they could. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, on the surface, at least. Inside, I was enjoying every second of the chaos. Watching these people scramble to undo the mess they'd created was almost poetic justice. For weeks, they'd acted like untouchable rulers, bulldozing my land without a second thought. Now, they were drowning in the consequences of their own arrogance. Mrs. Caldwell called me repeatedly, begging for leniency. "Please, Mr. Harris," she pleaded during one particularly desperate conversation. "Can't we find a way to make this right? We didn't know." "Didn't know," I interrupted, letting a hint of sarcasm creep into my voice. "You destroyed 600 acres of farmland without even checking who owned it. That's not ignorance, it's negligence." She stammered, searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, she said, "We'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Just tell us what you want." What I wanted was simple: accountability. But I also knew revenge wasn't about crushing them completely. It was about teaching them a lesson they'd never forget. So I offered a deal. Pay restitution for the damage they'd caused, revoke all claims to my land, and dissolve the HOA entirely. In exchange, I wouldn't pursue legal action against them or any of the residents caught up in the fiasco. They accepted, of course. What choice did they have? Without my agreement, they were facing lawsuits that would bankrupt them and leave hundreds of families homeless. Even then, I could see the relief wash over their faces when I agreed to the terms. They thought they were getting off easy. Little did they know, the real punishment was yet to come. As the days passed, the community unraveled. Some residents packed up and moved away, unable to face the embarrassment or deal with the uncertainty. Others stayed, humbled by the experience and more aware of how fragile their perfect suburban paradise really was. Those who remained approached me cautiously, apologizing for what had happened and thanking me for not pursuing harsher penalties. I nodded politely, accepting their apologies, but I didn't let them off the hook entirely. Let them carry the weight of their mistakes for a while. It would do them good. In the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. Neighbors began talking to each other, not just superficial small talk, but real conversations. People shared stories about why they'd moved to Whispering Pines in the first place, their hopes for the future, and their fears about losing everything. Slowly, a sense of community started to emerge, one built on honesty and humility rather than control and perfection. For me, though, the most satisfying part was seeing the former HOA members try to rebuild their lives. Mrs. Caldwell resigned from her position, retreating from public life altogether. Others stepped down quietly, avoiding eye contact whenever they crossed paths with me. They'd learned their lesson the hard way. Power means nothing if you abuse it. And as for me, I stood back and watched it all unfold, knowing that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's redemption. With the HOA officially dissolved and the subdivision project dead in the water, I turned my attention to fixing what had been broken. The land wouldn't heal overnight. Some scars ran too deep, but it was a start. Using the restitution money they'd paid as part of our agreement, I hired workers to replant crops, repair fences, and clean up the mess left behind by the bulldozers. It wasn't easy, but every seed planted felt like a step toward reclaiming what had been lost. The fields that had once been flattened were slowly coming back to life. Cornstalks began to rise again, swaying gently in the breeze. Wildflowers sprouted along the edges of the property, attracting bees and butterflies. Even the old oak tree near the fence line, which had narrowly escaped destruction, seemed to stand taller now, its branches stretching wide as if reclaiming their place in the sky. Every day, I walked through the farm, watching it recover, feeling a quiet pride grow inside me. This land wasn't just soil, it was resilience. And so was I. But the changes weren't limited to my fields. The people around me started treating me differently, too. Neighbors who had once dismissed me as a simple farmer now looked at me with newfound respect. Or maybe fear. Either way, I didn't mind. Those who stayed in Whispering Pines after the chaos began approaching me more humbly. Some apologized profusely, admitting they should have questioned the HOA's actions sooner. Others simply nodded in acknowledgement, grateful for the second chance they'd been given. One afternoon, as I was checking on a newly repaired section of fence, a man named Tom stopped by. He lived a few miles down the road, and had always struck me as the type to keep his distance. But today, he stood awkwardly at the edge of my field, twisting his hat in his hands. "Mr. Harris," he said, clearing his throat. "I just wanted to say, well, I'm sorry. For everything. We should have listened when you said something." I nodded, leaning against the fence post. "Apology accepted," I replied. "Just remember this next time someone tries to tell you something doesn't belong to you." Tom chuckled nervously, but nodded. "Won't happen again, I promise." It wasn't just Tom either. Conversations like this became more common. People were eager to make amends, to prove they weren't all bad. And while I appreciated the effort, I also knew forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning. If this whole ordeal taught them anything, I hoped it was that power without responsibility leads to ruin. As the weeks went by, the community itself began to change. Without the strict oversight of the HOA, residents started making decisions for themselves. Gardens appeared in front yards, painted in bright colors that would have violated the old rules. Kids played freely in cul-de-sacs, their laughter filling the air. There was a looseness, a freedom that hadn't existed before. Imperfection became beautiful in its own way. Even the former HOA members found ways to move forward. Some moved away, unable to face the embarrassment of their mistakes. Those who stayed kept a low profile, working quietly to rebuild trust. Mrs. Caldwell, once so polished and unshakable, was seen volunteering at the local library, her pearls replaced by practical cardians. She avoided me whenever possible, but I noticed her helping others when she thought no one was looking. Maybe redemption was possible after all. Standing on the porch of my farmhouse one evening, I watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The field stretched out before me, green and thriving once more. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was healing. And sometimes that's enough. Power isn't about control. It's about stewardship, about protecting what matters and using what you have wisely. These people had learned that lesson the hard way, and I hoped they'd carry it with them forever. Because in the end, owning the ground beneath your feet means nothing if you don't respect it, and those who walk on it alongside you. Months later, life in the county had settled into a new rhythm. The chaos of the HOA scandal had faded from the headlines, but its impact lingered in subtle ways. People were quieter now, more thoughtful. Conversations that once revolved around whose lawn looked better, or whether someone's mailbox color violated the rules, had shifted to topics like community gardens, shared resources, and how to keep local wildlife safe. It was as if the whole ordeal had stripped away the pretense, leaving behind something raw and real. For me, standing on my porch each evening became a kind of ritual. I'd watch the field sway gently in the breeze, listen to the crickets chirp, and think about everything that had happened. Owning an entire county sounds impressive, and it is, but it also comes with a weight I hadn't fully understood until now. Power isn't just about what you can do. It's about what you choose not to do. Letting go of anger, forgiving mistakes, and giving people a chance to rebuild. That was harder than any revenge could ever be. The land itself seemed to reflect this newfound balance. Crops grew tall again, their leaves catching the sunlight like thousands of tiny mirrors. Birds returned to nest in the trees, their songs mingling with the hum of bees buzzing around wildflowers. Even the soil felt richer, darker, as though it knew it was being cared for properly. Every day, I saw proof that healing takes time, patience, and effort. But when it happens, it's worth every ounce of work. Still, the lessons weren't lost on anyone, not even those who had wronged me. Former HOA members became almost unrecognizable. Where they once strutted around like overlords, they now moved quietly, helping neighbors carry groceries or volunteering at town events. Mrs. Caldwell, in particular, surprised me. One morning, she knocked on my door, holding a basket of freshly baked muffins. "I know it doesn't make up for anything," she said softly, avoiding my eyes. "But I wanted to say thank you for not ruining us completely." I took the basket and nodded. "We all make mistakes," I told her. "What matters is learning from them." She smiled faintly, then turned and walked away. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sometimes, a small act of kindness says more than words ever could. As for Whispering Pines Estates, the neighborhood transformed in unexpected ways. Without the rigid rules of the HOA, creativity flourished. Houses were painted in bold colors, gardens overflowed with vegetables and flowers, and kids built treehouses in backyards without worrying about fines. Neighbors gathered for barbecues, sharing stories and laughter under strings of twinkling lights. They weren't perfect, but they were human, and that made all the difference. Looking out over my fields one last time before heading inside, I realized something important. Owning the ground beneath your feet doesn't mean controlling it. It means respecting it, nurturing it, and letting it thrive. The same goes for people. You don't lead by force, you lead by example. And sometimes, the best way to teach someone a lesson is to give them space to grow. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a deep sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was moving forward. And that, I decided, was the greatest victory of all.